Let's get all philosophical today, shall we? We're going to be talking about Plato and Socrates, starting off with Socrates, and then moving on to his most famous pupil, Mr. Plato. So let's start off here and talking about what is philosophy, the definition, because it can be a bit confusing on the definition. It seems like you hear, what is my philosophy? You hear these terms kind of thrown around sometimes, and you're trying to figure out what exactly does it mean. So the most basic definition that I could give you is that philosophy is the study of knowledge. That's essentially what it is. And if you actually go and break down the Greek word into two parts, it goes to philosophia. Philo means love, like Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. And Sophia means wisdom. So if you know somebody named Sophia or Sophie, she should be very, very wise. So a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. So it's somebody who's going to go in ancient Greece and be involved in trying to figure stuff out. They are thinkers. And the idea is going and trying to be a good thinker to solve, hopefully, some problems that would be somewhat applicable in the world. Now, let's talk about the biggest philosopher, the most important one, because he's basically the first big-time philosopher that we've talked about in this course, and his name is Socrates, not Socrates, unless you're a Bill and Ted fan. And if you haven't seen that movie, you need to go watch it. Now, there's something that we refer to as the Socratic problem with Mr. Socrates, and here's the problem. He did not write anything down himself. Everything that we have is written about him is written by other people, specifically his student Plato. And when we look at Plato, it becomes difficult because it's hard to tell where Socrates ends and Plato begins. So the Socratic problem is that his works are not about him, are not from him. And Plato, when he's talking about his favorite teacher of all time, is going to provide some what we call bias. But we do know that Socrates was a real person. He's not an invention. Sometimes people throw that out there, but he was a real person. Who was he? He was born in Athens. If you are short and ugly, you have a chance in life, because according to the text, Socrates was short and ugly. So there you go. And he was the son of a sculptor, basically a humble origins. And he was also a military dude. He fought in the Peloponnesian War, which is the war between Sparta and Athens. Now, if you look, there's actually references in kind of some of Socrates' writing, or not writing, but stuff that supposedly he said. You get the idea of if a philosopher is not philosophizing, this is like a soldier retreating in battle. So we definitely have some evidence that Socrates was a soldier. Now, I have really good puns in here. Socrates could sock it to you. Please give me a pity laugh. One of the most famous stories of Socrates involves the good old Oracle of Delphi, or the Pythia of Delphi. I hope you remember her. And somebody basically went to her, and according to the Greek tradition, she could not lie at all. She wasn't a liar. And somebody said, was there anybody in the world wiser than Socrates? And the Pythia answered, no. And the source of the wisdom, according to the oracle, was that Socrates was the wisest man because he could go and understand his own ignorance. And the phrase is, I only know that I know nothing, or a wise man knows that he knows nothing. So you can just bust that out on your parents next time when they try to show some wisdom to you and see what the response is. Probably not going to be too good. Now, virtue. The concept of virtue is a concept that you can get really kind of caught up in, and, oh, what does this mean? Is it a weird thing? But basically, virtue is how should you act? What is right, what is wrong, and how should you act? And his virtues, what he says, the most important things are being a philosopher, being an intellectual, and going and philosophizing, essentially. And the virtues that you may think of, wisdom, temperance, courage, justice, all of those things are important. Now, this is near and dear to my heart, is the Socratic method, because this is a method that I use in class to get you to think. Now, let's talk about where kind of the origin of the Socratic method came from, obviously with Socrates. Here's what Socrates would do. Socrates would walk around the street and challenge somebody. He would ask them a question. Maybe he could start off a question and say, what makes a person good? And you would respond, and then he would go back and forth with you. And by the end of the conversation, most likely you felt like an idiot because your original response, he has proven through your logic is completely false. Sometimes the point was to make you feel like an idiot, but the larger point, and the reason I use it in class, is to go and make you think, and going in and being involved in what we call like logical reasoning. It's a type of reasoning that, like I refer to as Sherlock Holmesing, which is basically how do you go and find a murderer if you're Sherlock Holmes. You're going to go find basically everybody who's not the murderer, and the only person left will be the murderer. Or like if you've ever played Guess Who as a kid, right? You go and you get the little Guess Who things, and you find out who your person is by finding out who they're not. That's kind of the idea of a Socratic method. Like we say in class, not to win a debate, but it's to sharpen our thinking skills, and it's gone down the line. As you can see in this picture here, it's very common in law school to go and kind of have this case study method where you have to come with the knowledge of class, and the professor's job is not to go teach you everything. The job of the professor is to go and sharpen your thinking skills. Now, Socrates is going to get in some big trouble. He goes and starts to basically criticize democracy, and he's charged with 2 different charges. Kind of like Elvis, good old corrupting the youth. And he's also charged with interfering with the city's religion. He's critical of democracy, which is not good if you live in Athens. And he gets the lovely title, the nickname, the gadfly of Athens, like a horsefly, because he goes and annoys people so much. And Socrates goes to trial, and he is basically forced to commit suicide by drinking poison. Now, an interesting thing that comes out of this trial here is that Socrates goes, and he actually has a chance to escape. And he chooses not to take that chance. His buddies basically can get him out of jail before he's forced to commit suicide, and he doesn't do it. Now, there's kind of some reasons that people have thrown out there why Socrates didn't do this. Reason number 1, if he went and ran away, it would indicate that he feared death, and according to the belief of the day, a true philosopher did not fear death. So there was nothing to be afraid of. 2, he was basically, if he ran away, he was going to be chased like an animal and probably be caught at some point, so that's kind of embarrassing. And 3, the most important point is, although he disagreed with the subject of democracy, he was able to go and accept his punishment. And willingly accepting his fate goes and forms a movement around him that shows how incredibly important it is for his beliefs. So it kind of solidifies his movement. If you're willing to die for something, it's important. So this famous painting here, you can see the supporter of Socrates. He's handing the cup, and Socrates is going to take the poison and drink it. According to this story, Socrates was to drink the poison, walk around until his legs felt numb, and then when he felt numb, he laid down, and his famous final words were, I got to pay off a rooster. Don't forget to pay the guy the debt of a rooster. So kind of a fun story there. Socrates' death. Now, coming after Socrates, we have Plato. So Socrates and Plato. It's not Plato, it's Plato. So don't get confused. Plato is the stuff that you eat as a little kid. A lot of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato, because Plato writes in his book called The Dialogues. So if I can engage with dialogue with you, what I'm doing is I'm talking to you. And the dialogues are basically a record of conversations between Socrates and Plato. These are not like Socrates or Plato ran home and started recording these conversations after they took place. They're kind of more or less imaginary conversations, but they're pretty much something along the lines of what Socrates would have said. In addition, Plato had to go and form a school. And he forms a school which does not look original right now, but at the time, obviously, it's new. It's called Plato's Academy. So the school goes, and it was kind of the type of school that he established that allowed politicians to be trained and all this philosophizing to go on. The 2 examples of knowledge I'll talk about here in a second, the allegory and the cave and the divided line. Now, when we talk about Plato, he had an interesting theory, what we call the theory of forms. And with the theory of forms, essentially what happened is it's kind of a strange concept. Basically, before you are born in this world, there is an alternate reality where you know basically everything. You have access to all knowledge. And when you come into this world, your knowledge begins to be limited. When you learn something, you are actually going and remembering it from before. So, for example, if you've never heard of the theory of forms before, you actually knew it according to Plato. All I'm doing to you is helping you remember this and make that connection. It basically exists in another realm, another dimension. So it's kind of a complex concept, which he uses a couple different examples, specifically the allegory of the cave and the divided line. In addition, moving on to politics, he does not like democracy, obviously because his leader died because of it. And in his book, The Republic, he goes and lays out the concept of a philosopher king. Well, he says you shouldn't have a big old king in charge. You should, or excuse me, a democratic leader or leaders in charge. You should have a king in charge, but not just a normal king, the Burger King. Just kidding. The person who should be in charge is the philosopher king. Philosopher king is a philosopher who is also a leader. So a philosopher is supposedly has a higher level of knowledge. If they can have a higher level of knowledge, then they clearly, according to Plato, should be in control. It's kind of similar to if you're comparing like man to an animal. Who would you rather have in charge? You would rather have man, hopefully, maybe to like build an airplane, but than a chimpanzee, for instance. I know it's kind of a silly example, but that's kind of what Plato essentially is arguing, is that the philosophers have a higher level of knowledge than other people are aware of. So here's a look at Plato's Academy, doing all their philosophizing, checking it out. Like I said, it's the school that Plato established. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys is the divided line. So it might be a good idea to sketch this out if you haven't done this yet. So you have areas A to E. Basically, if you want to think about this, this is like all knowledge you can have. So this is like the God knowledge or something like that, like all the knowledge of the universe. And according to Plato, on the divided line, let's just take the region B to C. This is all the like knowledge of the universe that people have access to. That's that type of knowledge. Now the philosophers, however, for whatever reason, can go and extend their knowledge. Let's say they have the regular B to C, but they can get a little bit further out there. And they have this access to all this other knowledge they can't even describe to other people. So obviously, if they have that type of reasoning of, I can go and be in control and understanding things that you can't even comprehend, that's the reason they should be in control. So it's a bit of an interesting example. Allegory of the cave, we're going to take a look at in class. So if you have any questions, just be sure to ask.